Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered, your go-to podcast for anything and everything retail crime related, sponsored by Secura Global. Here is your host, Professor Emmeline Taylor.
Welcome to Retail Crime Uncovered. In this episode's newscast, I'll be catching up with Louise about the rising incidence of luxury food theft, from champagne to cheese. It appears that there's no grocery items now that are off limits. And I'll be catching up with Grant to hear about the aftermath of the US election and the implications for the retail sector in the USA. And also the increase in gift card fraud, which has reached such levels that it's now attracted the attention of Homeland Security. Our in-country focus in this episode is going to be South Africa. And I think you'll agree that some of the things taking place there are really quite shocking. And I caught up with Andre Jordaan. He's the head of the very first ORCA, Organised Retail Crime Association, in South Africa. And in this episode's spotlight, I'll be looking at the private security industry. There's been lots of conversations recently about private security, from whether we should be talking about security guards or security officers. It seems the terminology is important, to whether it should be in-house or third-party providers, what the training and powers should be for security operatives. So I'm going to catch up with the head of compliance at the Security Industry Authority. They're the regulating body who issue the licenses for officers across England and Wales. But before we get into that, I'm going to talk through some of the key recommendations that have been published by the House of Lords inquiry into shoplifting. Now, the report takes the form of a letter to Dame Diana Johnson. She's the Minister for Policing here in the UK. Now, the report spans 28 pages. There's no less than 24 key recommendations and conclusions that have been made. Now, I was honoured to be invited to be part of the evidence session, so provided oral evidence as well as written, alongside some key industry bodies such as the Association for Convenience Stores and retailers, including Paul Gerard from the Co-op. Now, I won't go through all the recommendations. As I said, they're really extensive. And what is so refreshing about this report is that it moves beyond diagnosing the problem. I think we all know the symptoms around rising levels of theft and escalating violence in and around our retail places. And it moves towards solutions. It begins to get much deeper than any other sort of government reports that I've seen in recent times into trying to tackle the root causes of shop theft, whether that's drug-affected offenders or whether it's organised criminal networks that are targeting the UK retail sector. Now, I'm just going to pick out a couple of key points here. Now, one, first and foremost, I think is really interesting, and I was delighted by the recognition that the term shoplifting is unhelpful, because we still think of it as describing petty theft, somehow victimless and not serious. And so the report goes so far as to say that the term should be phased out of legislation and guidance. And certainly in some of the forum that I've been in recent weeks, there has been a very noticeable shift to describe retail crime, shop theft, or even retail harm. So I think that's a movement that is definitely gathering momentum. And I was also really excited to see an emphasis on the stolen goods market. So this is something that I've been quite vocal about, I think, in recent months. And there's two recommendations here. The first one, they recommend that the government introduce regulations to make it more difficult to sell stolen goods online anonymously. And this certainly has a flavour of the legislation that was passed in the USA, the Informed Consumers Act, which makes it the responsibility of the large online marketplaces to verify the identity of bulk sellers. So potentially in the UK, could we be seeing moves towards a similar piece of legislation? And secondly, they recommend the launch of a public information campaign to raise awareness of the impact of shop theft and the stolen goods market. So I'm joined now by Chris Noice. He's the Communications Director at the Association for Convenience Stores. Hi, Chris. What are your first thoughts about the recommendations?
It's actually really encouraging that they kind of get it. They get that there's a huge issue with underreporting. There's a huge issue with theft. There are issues with the way that police prioritise and deal with crime. The one thing that it does do, just straight off the bat, is this idea of shoplifting. And I know you've mentioned this in your evidence, and we talked about this a lot. This idea of shoplifting being some kind of twee, kind of fun thing that some people do, and not being treated as a crime. People see that as don't call it shoplifting, call it shop theft. Like, some people see that as a minor thing. It's not a minor thing. Yeah. It actually makes quite a big difference in perception of what is quite a serious and quite a damaging crime for retailers. Yeah,
definitely. Because I just think that shoplifting term still has those connotations of being petty, trivial. There's no victim involved. So perhaps moving away from that. Do you think that's possible? Are we going to see that removed from the English vernacular?
Probably not, I'll be honest with you. But I think removed from everyone talking about it, I think is one thing. Removed from the idea of the decision makers talking about it in those terms, I think is achievable. And I think, talking to MPs, talking to officials, talking to police and crime commissioners, getting them to move away from this thing of shoplifting, Artful Dodger, kind of middle class, Waitrose, all this sort of stuff, getting away from that and talking about shop theft, which is primarily, it's organised, it's stealing to sell on, it's tens of thousands of pounds and it's millions of pounds a year. Speaking in those terms, I think with officials we can do that, and I think that is achievable.
Are there any surprises?
Surprises are probably not. I think one thing that I perhaps was surprised by was how much they were willing to go into talking about underreporting, willing to go into talking about the things that needed to be done by all the different police forces, and maybe highlighting some of the differences there are in intelligence gathering and identifying criminals. So referencing that Pegasus needs to continue, that idea of being able to identify people across different forces. So I think not necessarily surprises in terms of recommendations that are way out there, but certainly surprised and encouraged by the Laws Committee kind of reflecting what the industry is saying and saying that we need better reporting, we need reporting to be easier, and we need police to take things more seriously.
It does seem very thorough.
I guess if I were to be at all critical, and I appreciate the report can't be completely comprehensive, I think where the next steps are, and perhaps this is a separate inquiry or perhaps follow-up, is we've got everything here to make reporting easier, to make identifying criminals easier, to make spotting stolen goods easier. What we don't have here is how people get apprehended and what happens when they are. So there's nothing in here about where additional resource could be spent within police forces. There's nothing here to say, to reinforce to retailers that when you report a crime, that something will be done about it. And we talk about this with retailers all the time. The policy is here, and the policy is great, but the policing is missing.
So the letter is, as I said, it's written to the Minister for Policing. They're requesting a response by the Christmas recess to address some of these far-reaching recommendations.
Newscast.
Hi, Louise.
Hello.
So we seem to be seeing a rise in luxury food theft. So there's been some big cases recently, champagne, cheese. It seems like nothing is off limits at the moment. Let's start with the group that have been called the Champagne Gang. What can you tell us about this group?
Yeah, so this is extraordinary. This was a gang that was operating across the country, all the way from Gateshead to Bournemouth. And over 18 months, it's believed that they're involved in at least 60, and I say at least 60 separate sprees around different towns, possibly stealing up to £73,000 worth of goods. Now, the Champagne Gang is a brilliant title for them, but actually they stole all sorts of premium goods and premium wines. And as you say, it feels that luxury goods are really being targeted at the moment. And inevitably, when we saw food inflation of 20% last year, then it's no longer just clothes and electronics. Food is very expensive and has this huge resale value.
Exactly, there must be a big market for it. What's the technique that they're using? How are they actually stealing it? Is this from on the shelf or?
Yeah, so with this particular gang, it was very sophisticated. Yes, it was from the shelf, but they had Bluetooth earpieces, and so they could communicate with each other, let each other know when security guards were in the area and when they weren't. And then it was distraction theft. So one of them would hit an alarm, and then, of course, the security would run to one end of the shop, and they would walk out, sometimes pushing entire trolleys of champagne and wine, sometimes just filling baskets and rucksacks.
And do we know what they were doing with the champagne? Like, where was it being resold?
Well, extraordinarily, it's thought that they were actually taking it back to Romania. Now, that doesn't seem like the cheapest thing to do, but apparently worth their while. And we know that champagne prices have been particularly high recently, seen a huge rise because of issues with the crops. And then there was a big post-COVID boom in champagne sales because we all wanted to celebrate after we'd been in lockdown. So there was a shortage everywhere in Europe, and they were apparently taking it back to their home country to sell.
Wow, goodness. It just shows how all those external factors can sort of coalesce to then create a demand for a particular product. It sounds almost like the tactics that they're using sort of mirror some of the tactics that retailers use. So we see, headsets being worn by shop workers now so that they can communicate in store. So having these Bluetooth headsets, that's quite an interesting approach that they're taking.
Yeah, exactly. I've been into stores and seen how they're using these techniques, and it's exactly that. So the panic buttons are there for the staff for when they see shoplifters. Now shoplifters are using it against them to distract the staff. The Bluetooth headsets, as you say, are used all the time now. And yeah, they're using their own techniques against them. They're always one step ahead, it feels, at the moment on this.
Yeah, definitely. And hot off the heels of the champagne gang, we then saw a London business fell victim to the Great Cheese Robbery, is what it's being called. So hundreds of truckles of cheddar. I love that word. It makes it sound really cute and small. But actually, this was 22 tonnes of cheese was stolen, worth more than £300,000 from Neal's Yard Dairy. This was quite a complicated crime. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so this was a sophisticated crime where a huge order was placed for artisan cheese via Neal's Yard. And the suppliers were very excited to get such a huge order. It was for 950 wheels of cheese, which I'm told is the equivalent of 4 large elephants in weight.
Oh my goodness.
So the suppliers pulled out all the stops to make sure that this cheese was ready. It wasn't paid for in advance, I understand. And then it went off to the warehouse and was collected by a courier, perhaps not a courier, actually, in hindsight, and went off in a van and was never seen again. And the cheese was never paid for.
I mean, this was a crime that was several months in the making. So I think Neal's Yard was contacted back over the summer. They did their due process. They did their homework. They looked into the company. But what they didn't realise was that the fraudster was pretending to be the company that they then looked into, and they forged various documents to make the contract look legitimate. Now, it all seemed to run cold as a story, but there seems to have been a recent arrest.
There has been an arrest and someone's been bailed pending further inquiries, but we haven't heard anything since. But yeah, I feel really sorry for the suppliers in this who may never get justice, particularly if it's all gone abroad. It was a very sophisticated crime, and they were able to present themselves as a legitimate wholesaler. It is hard to defend yourself against that kind of sophisticated fraud.
Definitely. And what was so interesting is just how much global attention this story got. So lots of celebrities, including Jamie Oliver, was talking about this particular crime. He posted on Instagram to over 10 million followers about it. And quite often, I think when companies suffer this type of fraud, they keep it really quiet. Now, Neal's Yard went very public on this. That makes it really difficult for the criminals. How do you get rid of the equivalent of 10 elephants worth of cheese when it's so well known about?
Yeah, I think that they wanted it to go as wide as possible so that artisan cheesemakers, delis, restaurants, suppliers, etc., all over the world would be suspicious if they were suddenly presented with some beautiful cheese from Britain that was just sold at a price that was too good to be true.
Yeah.
I don't think they would be able to get rid of it in the UK or even Europe because the product was just too hot. It had such a lot of publicity. I suspect they never intended to sell it that close to home. And in fact, the suppliers themselves think that it's probably been resold in Russia, which makes sense when you think that because of the EU sanctions, they then retaliated and restricted imports of lots of European food products, including cheese. So if you want luxury artisan cheese from Europe at the moment and you're in Russia, it's coming through the black market. So I can see why suppliers would think that that's where it's gone. My worst fear, though, is that the cheese couldn't be resold and that it's just been binned off somewhere. That would be the tragedy in all this, wouldn't it?
Definitely. Do you know, that just made me think of, there was a famous case several years ago and a Henry Moore sculpture was stolen and the thieves were stealing it for scrap metal. And so they got a few £100s for this sculpture that was actually worth millions of pounds. So the idea then that this cheese, might not actually then be valued, it might be destroyed. There was a recent case in Russia, wasn't there, with the fromagicide, as it's being called, where they literally just annihilated all the cheese that had been imported.
Yeah.
So talking about the stolen goods market, I'm really pleased that this is actually starting to get quite a lot of attention. And we recently had the House of Lords inquiry into shoplifting in the UK. They recommend the launch of a public campaign to raise awareness of the impact of the stolen goods market. What do you think consumers are going to think? We love a bargain online, don't we? Do you think this could work? Will consumers actually question that the price is too good to be true?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I don't know how much consumers care if it's stolen, and I that's not right. But I think that we all should play a part in trying to clamp down on this and really question and interrogate deals that seem too good to be true. And maybe a lot of people don't realise that there's stolen goods on these nice secondhand websites. We all love buying outfits on Vinted. Everybody loves eBay. Maybe it's actually just not crossing people's minds. But I think a lot of people, perhaps in the back of their mind, might know.
Yeah.
And a little bit like the stealing from the self-service tills, don't see it quite as the crime that it is. I think a public awareness campaign is a really good idea. Just saying, you could be inadvertently handling stolen goods. Yeah.
Which itself is a higher penalty. If you knowingly do that, it's a higher penalty than the shoplifting crime in the first place. It can attract up to 14 years in prison. So perhaps that sort of hard-hitting information might land quite well.
Absolutely. Letting them know they could get into trouble for it if it's really obvious. Now, I was on Vinted last week and I found some clothes with the security tags on.
With the security tags?
And the description said, note the security tag's still attached, because they wanted people to know so they wouldn't complain afterwards.
And did they say why?
And no, they didn't. They didn't say why. But I immediately messaged them and said, "Oh, I'm just wondering why the security tags are attached," and got no response. Now, clearly, that's very obvious that you're handling stolen goods, and I like to think no one will buy it. But there's other signs as well, aren't there, that you could be buying stolen goods. So I think really interrogate the seller. Are they always selling masses of goods with the tags attached? Why would they be always be selling with the tags attached?
Could they not get the tag off? The company that provided that tag would love to know about that, because what a brilliant marketing thing. You can steal this item, but you're never going to remove the tag. So immediately you're devaluing that item on the black market.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
I mean, it's a bit of an amateur thing to do now, but there you go. But I also think bikes, be really careful. If a bike is sold at way under its resale value, even secondhand, you really need to interrogate that, because there's so many stolen bikes out there, aren't there?
Yeah. Do you know, my mate, actually, she was buying a bike. She thought it was completely legitimate, just somebody who wasn't using it anymore. It was on Gumtree. She phoned the mobile phone number and said, I'd like to come and have a look at the bike. How much is it? And the guy on the phone, I shouldn't laugh, but he called over to his friend, how much for that bike we nicked today? And she was like, oh my goodness, goodbye. But yeah, it's so blatant.
Yeah, and I think we should all be looking at the seller. So I think so often we just buy without really thinking, but go through what they've sold in the last month and ask yourself if that looks like a pile of stolen goods.
Yeah.
So I was trying to buy a Nintendo Switch for my children for Christmas, and there was someone selling 3 boxed Nintendo Switches for really cheap. And as much as I would have loved to have bought them that one, I was like, no, this does not sit right at all. Why would you have 3 brand new Nintendo Switches for such a cheap price?
Definitely.
And
then it could also be counterfeit as well. You know, there's lots of different things, isn't there, that you need to look out for. It's certainly going to make me, I love buying things secondhand. I love Vinted. I love Marketplace. But yeah, I am just starting to question things a little bit more than perhaps I used to.
Yeah, especially where it says new with tags. So I love the second-hand websites, but I try and actually find ones that are second-hand because I think it is being used as a place to pass off lots of stolen goods. So the ones that say new with tags, and I don't mean security tags, just the swing tags, I'm trying to avoid at the moment. I'm very suspicious of.
Well, let us know if you ever do get a response from that Vinted seller. Would love to know what that justification is. Brilliant. Thank you, Louise.
Spotlight.
So I'm joined now by Ronnie Megaughin from the SIA, the Security Industry Authority here in the UK. Thank you for joining the show. Can you tell us a little bit about the Security Industry Authority? What does the SIA actually do?
Yeah, so we're the regulator of the private security industry right across the UK. So we deal with where contracted services exist. So there are different approaches to security provision in the UK, but we deal with where it's a contracted service. We're an arm's length body of the Home Office, so we're answerable ultimately to the Home Secretary. And clearly, as you would expect, there are governance arrangements in relation to that accountability. And we license individuals. Currently, we have just shy, I think it is, of 500,000 licenses in the UK, and those cover a number of different sectors. And those sectors are relevant to the activities that are carried out by the individuals. So door supervisors, predominantly in licensed premises, security guarding, which is slightly wider but lesser in number, cash and valuables in transit, etc., CCTV, public space CCTV. So, and our role is to ensure that those individuals in the private security industry are suitable, so they're fit and proper, and they receive the initial license link training, so they have the skills and knowledge to enter into, hopefully providing a really valuable contribution to public protection across the UK. So in a nutshell, quite a big nutshell, but that's who we are.
And so how would somebody go about getting their SIA licence? Because that's a prerequisite, isn't it, to actually work as a security officer?
Yeah, it is. So, as I said, each of those licence categories has a different kind of entry requirement, effectively, in terms of the training that's undertaken. So, as you go through kind of a pyramid or a hierarchy of licence, ultimately close protection licences being the ones at the very top of that, you're required to complete a licence link qualification training. So those are provided by external training providers who are accredited by awarding organisations. And once you've got that, then you put your application into the SIA, and then there are other checks that are done clearly, as you would expect, the right to work check, there's criminal history checks done, etc., on the individual. And that's where we get ourselves to a point where we go, well, this person's undertaken the licensing qualification training, the standard of which is set by us but delivered by others. And we've done all the other checks and balances, so this person's now suitable to have a licence.
So I've heard you say security guard and security officer there. Is there a preference? Because I'm hearing that this is slightly contentious across the industry at the moment.
Yeah, the guard word comes from the legislation. So it's a throwback to our legislation, which was introduced 2001, and it makes particular reference to manned guarding. Now, that's a particularly unpopular term now. And
it's also quite sexist, I think, as well. I think it doesn't recognise the gender differences.
Yeah, it is. It's the way legislation's written, but it doesn't make it right at the end of the day. And we as a regulator, but also those who are vested in progressing and improving the industry, are really keen that diversity or the diverse content currently, the demographics of the industry improve. So we're about 10%. For a gender basis, we're about 10% females just now within all of those licence holders, and clearly there's a desire to increase that. So when you're using phrases like manned guarding, that in itself can be an obvious obstacle to people even considering it.
Absolutely.
So, and the other thing about the guarding part of it, whilst in the legislation it's guarding premises, guarding people and guarding property, those are legislative terms. But actually, in this day and age, the role of a security officer or a security operative should be viewed as much wider than that, because it is, and the skills that they possess are much more than this kind of very one-dimensional view on somebody just guarding something. It's a more complex role than that.
So there's skills, but there's also the powers that security officers have. A security officer in the UK, what powers are they actually given? Is it any more than a citizen?
No, it's not. It's a great question because it's a common misconception that as a consequence of holding an SIA licence, somehow they have a greater power as a result of that, and absolutely that's not the case. So they have exactly the same rights as a member of the public.
Would you or the SIA like to see guards be given more powers?
I was a police officer for 30 years. Before I came into the SIA, and I know how much investment, time was put into ensuring that police officers were as professionally equipped as possible to do a very, very difficult role in the UK. And that doesn't happen just by an initial training course. That's a constant refresher, a constant reminder, and at the back of everybody's mind, even as a police officer, despite the fact you have powers, is those powers must be used proportionately, appropriately, and within legal parameters. I think the security industry is not ready for that, and I don't think there's a place for that just now, to be entirely honest. I think policing has a role, law enforcement exists for a purpose. And I think the security industry complements policing, and I genuinely believe that. I think the danger is when you get into conversations around about it potentially replacing policing. I think they are very, very, very different entities. Sometimes security is perceived as a cheaper option for other things. Cheaper doesn't necessarily mean better, and you need to look at the appropriateness of what you're proposing in that setting. So the other thing about it is that there is always a cost inherent if you give people powers or you give people an additional set of skills, because if they're technical in nature or they have greater ramifications for getting them wrong, there's undoubtedly a far greater intensity around about refresher and reminder. All of that costs money when you're a security officer and you're having to pay for your own training. So I don't think we're ready for that yet.
I certainly think there is that misconception that outsourcing to the private sector will somehow save the public purse money, and as you quite rightly say, that's not always the case. There does seem to be a movement towards, of course, private security is complementary to policing, but as the police forces across England and Wales continue to be overstretched, under-resourced, and there's no significant changes to that on the horizon, do you see this being more of a movement towards private security, particularly, retail, criminal justice sector? Is that the direction of travel?
Yeah, so it is a live conversation just now. There's no hiding that. There are prominent people within the private security industry who are advancing that conversation with senior people within policing and hoping to have government ear as well. And I think that's a really healthy conversation to have. At a time of finite resource, finite budget, then you need to look at how you can deliver a quality service, which ultimately, let's be honest here, is about protecting the public out there, irrespective of whether it's coming from law enforcement or whether it's coming from private security. But it's not one of those things that you would wish to rush into without duly considering unintentional consequences, etc., of doing it. But there are really good examples within the UK of where there's hugely successful partnerships between policing and the private security industry. So those are all good. Those are exemplars of what you can achieve and how you can go about achieving it. But they didn't pop up overnight. They were as a consequence of the right stakeholders sitting about and giving informed contributions to really healthy and developed and some strategic conversations around about it. So going forwards, I think my experience from policing going forwards is, I mean, that's been a dramatically changing occupation over the piece. And I think they're unlikely we'll get to a position where there's going to be a huge pot of money that says, policing can have as much as it wants and it can do. That's highly unlikely with world economics and that for the UK. So I think that's what pushes those conversations. Are there roles that are currently done by warranted officers that potentially, or parts of, could potentially be done in a different way by a different group of people? That's not to say that, yes, it could, but if you don't explore it, you'll never realistically look at the potential for it. So I think it's it is a live conversation just now, and I think it's very healthy to have it.
And it would involve such a major restructure or major rethinking of how policing operates. We're very fortunate to have a country in which we have policing by consent. The vast population agree with police having the powers that they do. And, the exclusive use of violence as well. So I think there's some really quite fundamental questions that it raises, and particularly in a context as well where the police are suffering from record levels of low confidence from the public, low trust. And so, as you say, to then take big chunks of that and give it to the private sector, I do think it would raise some ethical and perhaps philosophical questions.
Yeah, and listen, I'm acutely aware of some of the negative press and somehow how much some of that's driven negative attitudes in relation to policing. But my experience over those 30 years, where there were some people in policing who shouldn't have been in policing, but they were incredibly small in number, and that hasn't changed. But the vast majority of people, who are involved in policing are absolutely dedicated and committed professionals who have a massive investment by their forces in terms of those skills, attributes, and everything else that I've said, and that comes at a cost. A police officer's cost is not just their salary, it's everything else that makes them as effective as they are. And the private security industry is not geared or structured that way. We're doing a lot of work just now about people are not even getting national minimum wage. So the business about, labour abuse, etc. within the industry. So we're cognizant of some of the issues that are present.
Yeah, absolutely. I've certainly heard some rumours around individuals who don't receive, the appropriate vetting. They're recruited through social media, and then they're not paid the national minimum wage. Yeah. How does that come to your attention, and then how do you regulate that or enforce the law? Yeah,
so currently so we created Operation Empower, which is our operational activity to address that, but we don't work in isolation in terms of that, because as you can imagine, some of the things you've just mentioned there, so failure to pay national minimum wage is a breach of the legislation. That's enforced by our colleagues in HMRC. The same bit around about designation of employment. Is it bogus self-employment? Is it genuine self-employment? HMRC issues. So we work very closely with HMRC and our colleagues in Home Office Immigration Enforcement as well, because what's come to our attention in the course of intelligence coming into us is that there is also sort of abusive visa status in the UK as well. So, as you know, those here are foreign students on a visa here who can only work 20 hours during term time, etc. The way that the industry delivers and deploys sometimes enables people to almost mask and hide how many hours they've worked. And it's down to a really good employer to apply due diligence, or a contractor to apply due diligence. That's what the key is, to target hardening against this issue. But it's no surprise to me, having had a variety of different roles within policing, part of which was around about organised crime, that people will seek to make profit at the expense of others, and this provides an opportunity for some. And then there's poor people who are getting £8 an hour in their hand, thinking they're actually going to benefit from it because they're not paying tax on it. Yeah, but with that, you don't have holiday pay, you don't have employee protections, and all the sorts of things that we would all take as a reasonable right in this country. So, yeah, but there are people who are exploited in that situation. There's evidence of it. And
Robbie, wow, that's been really interesting. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, my pleasure.
Newscast.
Hi, Grant. How are things over in the US?
Not bad. It's been a great year so far, and as you can see, we're through an administration change, so fun times ahead.
I feel like I heard something. Has there been like an election or something over there?
It's pretty recent, and it was, honestly, if you think about the elections in the past, it was decided fairly quickly for the U.S. So within the first 24 hours, we knew, which I think actually helped in some of the public safety arena.
Yeah, so I was hearing that in some of the swing states that retailers were feeling quite nervous about the potential for civil unrest in the aftermath of the election results. Has anything transpired in those ways?
Truly, and that's where leading into it, that was expected, just kind of given the history with it all. But I mean, you're New York, Portland, Washington, Houston, some of your bigger cities, you expect some protest, civil unrest, especially with Oregon and Washington having some of the ballot boxes burned ahead of time. There was that expectation. But again, I think since it was announced pretty quickly, there wasn't as much buildup, turmoil, and all that unrest with it. It was a pretty quick turnaround. What
are you anticipating from this term in office? Do you think there is going to be a big impact on retail? Do you think we will see more civil unrest? Maybe not immediately, but in a few months, if not years. What's the sort of sentiment on the ground?
In the retail, it's a tough environment right now. I mean, we're coming also into the holidays, and we know holiday and shoplifting in the U.S. has been an uptick compared to crime in the U.S. as a whole in 2024 is on a downward trend from the past few years. But in the retail sector, shoplifting's up. Other crime types are up. So in the months and years ahead, there is a lot of movement going on behind the scenes, be it federal or state jurisdictions, to try to give more assistance to law enforcement and to develop these collaborations between private sector or your retail and law enforcement, because they know this is a growing issue and they need assistance across both sides of that.
Definitely. And there has been some sort of legislative movements and suggestions. What's the Grassley bill that I've been hearing about?
The Grassley bill, or CORCA, the Combating Organized Retail Crime Act, has bipartisan support. It's been growing in kind of, I think, how much it's been accepted, but really it's trying to develop create a multi-agency task force under Homeland Security investigations that's really trying to build that collaborative effort between local jurisdictions, the federal government, and just building that collaborative effort, be it prosecutorial or law enforcement. It's truly aimed at trying to reduce some of this retail crime issue and developing a set task force to do so.
And so this task force, that would be a national task force, would it? Working across all of the states, or would this be state-based?
Ideally, since it's at the federal level, it would start from there. And then they would look for that support or collaboration within states. Of course, some of their states, you have a lot of local ORCAs or organized retail crime associations, but this goes beyond that. So they'll try to truly find local jurisdictions, prosecutors at the same time, to work with the feds, because I think they need more of that cross-jurisdictional level to be effective in this effort. It's going beyond state boundaries.
Wow, I mean, it sounds huge. Who's going to pick up the bill for this? Is there an expectation that retailers part fund this initiative?
To my knowledge, we haven't gotten into the financing side of it. With that, I think it's from the Fed side. The retailers are already losing millions at the end of the day. And it's trying to track this down, and it's from a multitude of different efforts. And organized retail crime ends up affecting all of us at large through just other inflation and everything with that. That's trying to go in to combat this and reduce this at large. If anything, I think it's more on the federal side to make an investment in this. Retail crime continues to grow in what we see in the news in terms of how it's affecting us. So I think there needs to be that concerted effort. With that, it's also building the collaboration between federal and local, which I think we all want to see. You see Department of Justice put a lot of money into that before in terms of other policing initiatives. I think that falls in that same bailiwick, in that same wheelhouse of you're trying to build collaborative to make crime reduce. I would put it on the feds more so than the retailers to do this.
And so where is the bill up to so far? You said it's got support from across the political spectrum. When will we expect to actually see this be passed and enacted in legislation?
That's a great question. With that, there's no true timeline. We know how this goes, especially with an administration change, what comes up first, the voting procedures and everything with that. I wouldn't be shocked if it gets pulled up in 2025 and they try to push forward, because I think this is the right time at the end of the day, everyone's affected by retail crime, and we're going to purchase anything, not only the businesses, but the consumers. And I think that's why it's starting to garner more and more bipartisan support, is everyone's affected by this. So I think it is going to be one of those items that does come up relatively quickly. It was introduced late 2023. It's kind of grown in support over 2024. So I think in 2025, if not early 26, there will be some effort in this. It might change similar to other bills and acts with that. But I think the overarching idea of it, something will come from it.
It's certainly one to look out for. I was lucky enough to recently be at a conference in Nashville, and I was talking to a senior asset protection manager there who was telling me about gift card fraud that was impacting the USA. So I've been doing a little bit of reading up on it, and I came across an initiative that has come out of the Homeland Security investigations, the HSI, called Project Red Hook. Now, they lay the blame quite firmly on Chinese organised criminal gangs that are targeting the USA and committing all sorts of different variants of gift card fraud. Can you tell us a bit about this crime type? How is it happening?
Yeah, and you summed it up quite well there. It's an interesting take by HSI to focus on a Chinese organized retail crime group in the sense of that. But oftentimes they're partnering with runners in terms of who's on the ground in the US, be it Chinese nationalists or Chinese Americans, who are doing some of this on the ground work. And it could be gift card tampering. It could be setting up the victim assisted fraud, which oftentimes here we see it on the local news of the telemarketers, people on the phone calling you, trying to obtain information from you. Then they're using that to buy gift cards and purchase it and redemption codes and everything with that. Even email phishing hacks with that. But they're truly trying to get those redemption codes or the pins on the back of cards to where they tamper with them. They have all that card information. Then they go back, put the cards, be it back in the retailer's stock, and then they have all the information to use those, and they can sell it through the, be it darknet or anything with that, but they have access to it all. So it does create this conundrum for retailers to now work against.
Gosh, that's so interesting. So some criminals are going in, they're buying multiple gift cards, getting the information, somehow then covering up the fact that they've been able to access the PIN, and then taking the cards back and putting them back on the shelves. Is that?
Or it's running it through them. So yeah, so they're tampering with it to where they can scratch the pin or putting a new pin over it to where they still have access to the card number and the pin itself. So when there's money added to it, they have that information. So then it can be used, and that's where they're linking it to a lot of, be it drug trafficking, human trafficking, even purchasing items in the US and shipping them overseas to be resold. It's a conglomerate of different crime or illegal activity that's happening with this. And it's been somewhat difficult to track. That's why they've developed that kind of this specific project to focus on that itself. And gift card fraud continues to kind of grow. And this one was very particular to focus on Chinese organized crime groups itself.
I mean, it must be very lucrative to have individuals actually then coming over to the US in order to commit these crimes, or employing runners, as you say, on home soil. Is there any indication of just what the financial impact to the industry is?
When I was reading on this, it looks like it's in the hundreds of millions, and depending on the scale of it and what they can link to specifically Chinese organized crime groups, potentially billion, but it's at that point, it is hundreds of millions of dollars. And then there becomes the issue of you have still consumers purchasing cards and the victimization side of them. If it's the phishing attacks or victim assisted, you now have this distrust in some retail groups itself based on the consumer, which is then problematic even long term. So yes, there's that quick financial part and gift card fraud, but then it could lose you customers in the long term too.
That's such a good point. The consumer experience that, that if they fall victim to this and feel that they've been put in a vulnerable position, and perhaps, the businesses haven't done enough to support them, you can see how that could have a really negative impact. So this Homeland Security Investigations Initiative, how are they going to tackle this? Or is this going to be the end of gift cards? How do you clamp down on this type of behaviour?
And I think it's similar to coming back to the Grassley bill. It's trying to build that collaborative network. So it is the communication from federal law enforcement and prosecution to local jurisdictions and retail. So it is this cross-pollination group of, you need multiple people sitting at a table if you're going to solve that problem. You can't take it just from one side or the other. It is a retail issue, but law enforcement are dealing with it heavily. And it's an international issue that's affecting the US. So we truly have to have multiple people at that table to combat it. So I think it's where you have to start with this and kind of keep heading in that direction. They're still tracking groups, the network itself, and I won't be surprised if they continue to make arrests and prosecutions in this endeavor.
Country focus.
So I'm really excited to be joined now by Andre Jordaan. He used to be a security manager in the retail sector, and he's now set up the first organised retail crime association in South Africa. So, Andre, I was really interested in an article that I saw recently in Business Tech, a publication in South Africa, and it's talking about the escalation in hijackers targeting the delivery fleets because of the e-commerce boom in South Africa, which they pinpoint to really, taking off during the pandemic. What's happening with this trend? I mean, it sounds very scary.
It's actually unreal, but it's a reality. We see a lot of hijackings of delivery vans, trucks, all of these type of things. Even delivery guys, with us we have Checkers 60/60 deliveries. Woolworths have got these deliveries, little guys on motorbikes, and they are actually also targeted, not specifically for the motorbike, but for what they carry.
And that's different, isn't it now? Because it used to be that hijackings happened in South Africa for the vehicles, but now it's what the vehicle is carrying or what's inside. So that seems to be a real shift now. Are these people, are they armed when they do these hijackings?
In many cases, they are armed. Mostly that I know of. But if you look at what the tracking company Tracker states, that 55% of their hijackings is vehicle crime in the country. So, and when a vehicle gets hijacked, in 81% of those cases, you've got fast-moving consumer goods on those vehicles. And that's alcohol, groceries, homeware, medication, whatever they carry. General hijacking in the country, you talk about around apparently 60 vehicles per day. So what I've seen is that with retail brands, delivery vehicles, when they get hijacked multiple times in a brand, one company's vehicles, it may happen once a month or twice a month, but it's an ongoing type of thing. And the problem is to identify these hijackers and actually to bring them to book. And that is where the big problem lies. But it also makes you think, where do they get all the information from?
Is there much intelligence on who these people are? Are they're gangs, I presume? Are they linked to serious organised crime, or are they just opportunists?
I think they are both. That is just my opinion. The South African Police Service is so busy, they're so overloaded, and then they also have a lot of corruption in their ranks. So to bring these people to book is really a big problem. You've got the same with shoplifting. Some companies don't even report shoplifting anymore because of the long prosecution. It can take you years to get a shoplifter prosecuted. So there are crime committed by organized crime, and then there is also crime committed by individuals. That is opportunistic, I would believe. But if you look at the delivery aspect itself, some of these companies use CIT vans to deliver some of their deliveries.
Sorry, they're using cash in transit vans now to deliver e-commerce, things that have been purchased online. So, you know, it could be clothes, trainers, groceries.
Yeah. They use these CIT vans for certain deliveries, but it's got a huge cost.
I can imagine.
What happens now, and what will happen now, is that the CIT robbers stop the truck and they bomb the truck and they rob the truck, and there goes your delivery as well. So it's not a lot of deliveries as far as I know that goes with it, but that was also an option at some stage to deliver stock.
Wow.
So yeah, the picture is quite bleak.
I mean, that is really escalating things to begin bombing CIT vans that are trying to deliver just everyday purchases to consumers. Gosh, has anybody been prosecuted for any of these types of offences?
The police has got a special unit, a special investigation unit. They look at the CIT robberies and all of that type of things. But we also have so many of them that we actually, as citizens, we almost used to it, to hear about the CIT truck and don't go through this route, avoid that route, because there was a robbery, and then the vehicle was stopped and bombed, and these type of things. So I wouldn't say it happens every day, but every now and then it does happen, and that's all, unfortunately, a reality.
Oh my goodness. And so when they bomb the CIT van, presumably that's going to destroy the stock as well. Is that a tactic as a warning or a threat, or is it a way that they can get hold of some of the stock at least?
I think they do get hold of some of the stuff. I'm not involved with the CIT people, but I believe they do get away with enough money or stock or whatever that's in that vehicle.
Gosh, and you think some of this could be collusion, people perhaps telling them the routes or what's inside some of the vans to make sure that they're targeting the more high value transits?
Definitely with cash and these type of things. Maybe, I'm just speculating, maybe the deliveries are now just part of the whole consignment. But that is definitely organized crime. We've seen that. They are very organized. They've got heavy weapons. It's like a war on the highway. It's a big thing. So they've got many cars, many members, and people are really scared of it.
Gosh, I mean, that does sound absolutely terrifying. And, you know, for those delivery drivers as well, presumably it's quite difficult to recruit people to actually work in those positions then.
That is very true. Yeah, people do realize that it is dangerous. But then if you have no other employment, then you take what you can get. Fortunately, we stand today.
Gosh. So you're taking steps to really try and change things in South Africa, and you've recently launched the Organised Retail Crime Association there. Tell me a bit about this.
So when I was doing the training for the company that I worked for, I saw the gap in the market, and I thought, you know what, we really need to do something with and for the retailers and for the staff, because at the end of the day, they lose a lot of money. They don't always know what to do. So the staff loses their jobs. Businesses close because of theft and fraud and all of these type of things. And I thought, okay, I've got experience. I've got a bit of academics behind me. So let me set this up. Let's try and identify and detect organized crime in the retail environment. Let's raise awareness against that. So we can do the investigations when we need be, and we can also train the LP guys what to look out for and how to do these investigations with law enforcement to try and create that collaboration. So just to stand up there and to make a difference, and also for me to give LP a voice. We've got to stand up and we've got to do something about this. We cannot just keep quiet and just let it go.
What's the police response been to Orca, South Africa? Are they pleased that, you know, you're willing to sort of step in and assist them where perhaps they don't have resources?
At the moment, for where I was talking to people and making connections and all of that, I get a very positive response. Although we are still fairly new, people still need to try and figure out where we stand, are we trustworthy, all of these type of things. So it will take a little bit of time, but we are confident that we will actually make a difference.
Wow, thank you, Andre. That's been so interesting to hear.